Fifth Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
All the communications between the
On the night of January 27, 1986, in the bone-chilling cold of Florida, a group of engineers huddled together inside a meeting room at Morton Thiokol. There were no cameras, no spotlight, just a model of the space shuttle placed in the center of the table, and a circle of tense eyes fixed on it. Bob Ebeling stared intently at the technical drawings, then quietly muttered to a colleague a sentence that would later haunt all of America. Tomorrow, the shuttle is going to explode. No one in that room dared to respond, because they too knew that something was very wrong. Very wrong. And unbelievably, less than 12 hours later, the entire country stood frozen in shock as the Challenger burst into flames live on national television, taking with it 7 lives and millions of hopes. But the most disturbing part wasn't the explosion itself. It was this. How did they know beforehand? And why did no one stop it? Today, Mind Gap takes you back to that fateful night. To the moment when a hidden truth was buried and stayed hidden for nearly 40 years. In January 1986, the entire United States was turning its eyes toward Cape Canaveral, where the Space Shuttle Challenger was preparing to launch into orbit. This was not just another routine mission in the space program. It was a national symbol. President Ronald Reagan had planned to highlight the event in his State of the Union address, aiming to emphasize America's pioneering role in space exploration. And Christa McAuliffe, a high school teacher from New Hampshire, the first ordinary woman to fly into space, had become the face of the American dream. Her image appeared in newspapers, on television, and even in school textbooks. Across the country, classrooms were getting ready to turn on their TVs to witness the moment she stepped into history. But amid the optimistic atmosphere, a small group of people couldn't sleep. They were engineers at Morton Thiokol, the company responsible for manufacturing the solid rocket boosters for the shuttle program. Bob Ebeling, Roger Boisjoli, and several other engineers quietly reviewed temperature data and made a chilling discovery. The weather at Cape Canaveral on the morning of January 28th would be colder than any previous launch in NASA history. Forecasts predicted temperatures below 0 degrees Celsius, which could directly affect the flexibility of the rubber O-rings, critical components that sealed off hot gases from escaping the engine. Roger Boisjoli had already written in an internal memo on July 9, 1985, "If the shuttle launches under cold weather conditions, I predict we could lose the entire crew." On the night of January 27th, an emergency meeting was held between NASA and Morton Thiokol. The company presented its case. The O-rings could become brittle and lose their sealing capability at low temperatures, increasing the risk of hot gas leaks and explosions. The engineers earnestly urged a launch delay, at least until the weather warmed. Initially, Morton Thiokol supported the technical recommendation. But after NASA reacted harshly and asked them to reconsider their position, the company's management instructed the engineers to withdraw their warning. In that moment, technical judgment was silenced by political pressure and public image. That night, Bob Ebeling turned to his wife and said, "They're going to launch, and it's going to blow up." NASA didn't just want a successful mission. They needed a triumph. Christa McAuliffe was set to teach the first lesson from space: live on national television. The president would mention her in his speech that very evening. A delay would ruin the golden moment politically and in the media. According to the Rogers Commission's investigation after the disaster, one striking conclusion stood out. The decision-making process was strongly influenced by schedule and image pressure, rather than pure technical analysis. At that pivotal moment, science took a backseat to politics. The warnings weren't ignored because they lacked evidence. They were ignored because they came from people who had no power over the final decision. Engineers like Roger Boisjoli would live with guilt for the rest of their lives. In an interview with NPR, Boisjoli confessed, "I could never shake the guilt I felt watching them launch that shuttle." The race between faith in technology and the desire for media glory ultimately cost America dearly. Not just in the loss of 7 lives, but in the erosion of trust in truth itself. Challenger wasn't just an accident. It was the result of a chain of decisions where technical data was pushed aside to make room for something called national idealism. And when everything converged on a freezing morning in Florida, the outcome became inevitable. Early morning on January 28, 1986, the ground at Cape Canaveral was frozen. The thermometer read just 18 degrees Fahrenheit, around -7 degrees Celsius, marking the coldest temperature ever recorded for a NASA shuttle launch. While the entire United States was preparing to turn on their TVs to witness a historic moment, a group of engineers in Utah had stayed up all night, gripped by fear of what they were certain would happen: a disaster. Bob Ebeling, Roger Boisjoli, and their colleagues at Morton Thiokol had been warning for days that the O-ring seals, rubber components that sealed the joints between segments of the solid rocket boosters, might not function properly in cold conditions. This wasn't a new concern, but this time the conditions were drastically worse. Previous tests showed that O-rings began to fail below 53 degrees Fahrenheit, but they had never been exposed to a freeze like that morning. Boisjoli had written in an internal memo to the company in July 1985, "If we launch under these cold conditions, the risk of losing the entire crew is high." He had voiced this concern in multiple meetings before, but was often dismissed as overly pessimistic. On the night of January 27th, just hours before launch, Morton Thiokol held an emergency meeting with NASA representatives. The engineers urgently presented their data analysis, along with visual evidence from previous test failures, showing that at low temperatures, the O-rings had a tendency to harden and lose elasticity. Without flexibility, hot gases inside the booster could escape through the seals and ignite. Bob Ebeling was adamant. Given that morning's forecasted cold, the risk was unavoidable. In an interview years later with NPR, he said, "I knew it would blow up. I just couldn't convince anyone to believe me." But things took a turn when NASA expressed dissatisfaction with the engineers' conclusion. They asked Morton Thiokol to reconsider their position. At that point, under pressure to maintain good standing with NASA, the company's management excluded the engineers from the next round of review. With no dissenting voices, the recommendation was changed from "do not launch" to "go for launch." According to the Rogers Commission's investigation, this meeting was a turning point. It clearly demonstrated managerial interference and the deliberate silencing of those who knew the technical system best. One note from the report stated, "NASA relied on incomplete data and dismissed warnings from the engineers who had studied the booster system in depth." In reality, the final decision came from Morton Thiokol's top management. They held a private meeting, lasting about 30 minutes, without including any of the protesting engineers. Afterward, they sent a fax to NASA officially approving the launch. Roger Boisjoli later testified, "We were cut out of the meeting. No one came back to ask us anything. We just sat in silence, powerless." What's most telling is that, at a time when all eyes were on Krista McAuliffe's historic launch, delaying the mission for technical reasons was seen as unacceptable. NASA had planned the president's address. TV crews were ready. Classrooms across the country had prepared to watch live. At that moment, no one wanted to be the person to derail America's space dream. So instead of saying no, they chose silence. And the price of that silence just hours later was a terrifying explosion in the skies over Florida, one that ended the lives of the entire crew. Challenger didn't explode because of an unforeseen error. It exploded because someone saw the risk, spoke up, and was pushed aside. In the history of space exploration, perhaps no warning has ever been more clearly ignored. And that is the part that hurts the most. No one could have imagined that the disaster would be so beyond their control. When the engineers at Morton Thiokol sent their final warning about the risk of explosion due to O-rings stiffening in freezing weather, they didn't know that, at a higher level, the game had already shifted. The issue was no longer about temperature or engine systems. It was about a broadcast schedule. That evening, the White House was in full preparation mode for President Ronald Reagan's State of the Union address. According to the original plan, once the Challenger shuttle successfully launched, Reagan would go on air and emphasize the accomplishments of the U.S. space program, especially the story of teacher Christa McAuliffe, the first ordinary woman selected to fly into space. It was the perfect narrative to inspire Americans in the post-recession era. For the media, this was a gift from heaven. A historic launch, a relatable face for the public, and a president ready to use the event to reshape America's image. So if Challenger got delayed again, this being the 6th delay due to weather and technical issues, not only would the broadcast schedule collapse, but the entire media campaign would fall apart with it. NASA understood this better than anyone. Inside the agency, once seen as the pride of American science, political pressure had crept into every meeting room. According to documents released later, NASA had become obsessed with something they called the realistic flight schedule, a schedule not created by engineers, but by project managers and PR teams determined to make every launch happen on the promised day. In congressional hearings, several former NASA staff admitted that top leadership had repeatedly stressed that further delays would negatively affect next year's funding. When your operating budget depends on congressional approval and Congress is influenced by live TV coverage, science becomes nothing more than a sacrificial pawn. A veteran reporter from the Washington Post later remarked, "Instead of following lab logic, they acted like people trying to meet the 6 o'clock news deadline." There was even an internal NASA memo from December 1985, written by Deputy Director Alan McDonald, emphasizing, "We must launch Challenger before the end of January. Don't mess up the president's speech." The scary part is the decision to go ahead with Challenger's launch didn't come from any direct order. As Roger Boisjoli described it, it was an invisible cloud of pressure hanging over the entire decision-making process. No one said it outright, but everyone knew if Challenger didn't lift off, someone would be blamed. Not for risking astronaut lives, but for embarrassing the public image. And so, within just 60 minutes of receiving the technical warning from the engineers, Morton Thiokol reversed its stance. NASA accepted the company's faxed approval, and mission STS-51L was officially cleared for launch. At 7 a.m. on January 28th, outside the Kennedy Space Center, frost still covered the launch platforms. The temperature held steady at just 18 degrees Fahrenheit. But behind office windows, people were smiling, because everything was going according to plan. No one mentioned the warnings from the night before. No one brought up the O-rings. No one asked a single question. In just a few hours, millions would cheer as the Space Shuttle Challenger lifted off. And only minutes later, they would fall silent as it exploded in the sky. At that moment, no one remembered the broadcast schedule. No one mentioned the president's speech. And no one took responsibility. Only one quiet question remained in the wake of the disaster. Since when did human lives come second to television schedules? 73 seconds after leaving the launch pad, the Challenger space shuttle disintegrated over the skies of Florida. The image of the shuttle being swallowed by a massive fireball was seared into the memory of millions. Television networks immediately cut their broadcasts. Prayers were whispered over the radio. The entire nation went silent, believing that the 7 astronauts had perished in an instant. But the truth might be far more horrifying. Because according to declassified documents released later, the crew cabin, where the STS-51L crew was working, was not destroyed immediately. According to the official report by NASA and the Rogers Commission, the crew compartment remained intact after the shuttle's main structure broke apart. It continued to fall freely for nearly 3 minutes, from an altitude of over 14 kilometers, until it slammed into the Atlantic Ocean at roughly 333 kilometers per hour. During that time, inside the compartment, at least 3 astronauts had activated their personal oxygen packs, a procedure that could only be done manually. Those oxygen packs were not automated. They couldn't be triggered if the astronauts had lost consciousness, which means they were still alive. They knew what was happening. They realized their cabin was plummeting into the ocean, and they fought until the very last second. A NASA internal memo released in 1987 stated, "We cannot determine the exact time of death of the crew members, but there is evidence that some remained conscious after the breakup." The Orlando Sentinel, in a 1988 article, also quoted an anonymous investigator. "When we discovered the oxygen packs had been used, we knew this was no instant death." So the question is, why weren't these details made public from the beginning? Why were the American people and the world led to believe that the Challenger exploded entirely and that no one had time to react? Was someone trying to protect the nation from another wave of outrage, knowing that 7 human beings fell into the sea? Fully aware? For nearly 3 agonizing minutes? Bob Ebeling, the engineer who had warned about the launch, said in a late-life interview, "The government chose to let the public believe in an instant death because they knew that if people found out the crew was alive until the last moment, everything would change." And it wasn't just about lives lost. The cause of the breakup had also been misrepresented. Many still believe that Challenger exploded completely right after liftoff. But in reality, there was no full-scale explosion. According to technical analysis, the failure occurred when hot gas from the right solid rocket booster leaked through a damaged O-ring. It burned through the external fuel tank insulation, weakening the shuttle's structure and causing it to break apart under dynamic pressure. There was no black mushroom cloud, no nuclear-like detonation. Just a chain of engineering failures, triggered by a rubber seal that couldn't survive the cold. And it didn't kill 7 people with fire. It killed them with silence. This misunderstanding about a massive explosion, about instant death, about an unavoidable accident, helped NASA and others preserve their public image for years. But as more evidence emerged, that mask slowly peeled away. And people began to realize the Challenger disaster didn't end in 73 seconds. It dragged on for another 180 seconds, in darkness, with no radio, with no light, only the sound of breathing from those who had been abandoned by the very system they served. That's why Challenger became one of the most heartbreaking disasters in the history of aerospace. Not only because it took the lives of 7 extraordinary humans, but because from the very first second, it was wrapped in a version of the truth that was easier to accept and far harder to live with. 1 year before the Challenger disaster, in January 1985, NASA carried out mission STS-51C, also with the Challenger shuttle, and again in freezing weather conditions. After the flight, a shocking discovery was recorded in the technical report. The O-rings on the solid rocket boosters had shown clear signs of severe erosion. This was not something anyone had previously predicted. Photos taken from recovered parts revealed visible burn marks around the seals. Subsequent data from NASA's own engineers, as well as Morton Thiokol's, showed a significant increase in the risk of O-ring failure when ambient temperatures dropped below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Simulations conducted in the months that followed confirmed the same result. Cold weather made the rubber seals stiff, reducing their elasticity and allowing hot gas to leak through. But instead of treating this as a clear warning sign, NASA's management drew a completely different conclusion. In an internal meeting, they said, "We've flown in cold conditions and survived. That means the system is still safe." This flawed logic, known as confirmation bias, led decision-makers to completely misjudge the actual risk. The cruel irony was that the O-rings had already been classified by NASA as Criticality 1, the highest risk level in the system. If they failed, the shuttle would explode, and the entire crew would be lost. So why did the system allow such a critical component to remain in use with no backup solution whatsoever? Perhaps it wasn't just the rubber that had deteriorated, but NASA's own culture of caution. When an organization becomes too large, too confident in its past achievements, every warning begins to sound like background noise. And even the clearest evidence can be buried with just one sentence. "We've done it before, and nothing happened." But this time, "nothing happened" was no longer true. Right after the Challenger explosion, NASA held a press conference and called it an unexpected malfunction, an unforeseeable accident. No mention was made of the warnings that had been ignored just hours earlier. Under public and media pressure, they chose to blame a technical failure no one saw coming, rather than admit to mistakes in decision-making. On the other side, the Morton Thiokol engineers, those who had risked everything to sound the alarm about the O-rings, were told to remain silent. They were removed from internal investigation meetings, monitored closely, and strictly forbidden from speaking to the press. Only when Chief Engineer Alan McDonald, who had refused to sign the final launch approval, decided to testify before the United States Congress, did the truth begin to emerge. In a historic 1986 hearing, he declared, "We had clear evidence that the weather posed a danger, but it was all ignored due to schedule and political pressure." The price he paid was steep. He was demoted, isolated from major projects, and nearly pushed out of the industry. Roger Boisjoli, the first to write the warning memo about the O-ring, fell into depression, left the field, and lived the rest of his life feeling defeated. Bob Ebeling carried the guilt to his final days, bitterly saying in an interview, "We knew it was going to blow up, and no one listened to us." 36 years later, in 2022, a documentary team filming a World War II project accidentally discovered a 20-foot piece of Challenger debris resting at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. That moment served as a final reminder. Some truths are never buried, only delayed. And some people, though forgotten, remain living witnesses to a tragedy that never should have happened. After the Challenger disaster, NASA moved quickly to reform. They redesigned the O-ring system, tightened inspection protocols, and created an independent safety office to ensure all technical warnings were sent directly to NASA, without being filtered through contractors. But in 2003, when the Space Shuttle Columbia disintegrated upon re-entry, a chilling truth was revealed. NASA had once again ignored engineers' warnings, believing once more that it had always worked before. The final question we're left with is this: have we really learned anything? Or are we simply repeating the same mistakes, just wearing a different mask? If you ever thought Challenger was a tragedy no one could have predicted, maybe it's time to think again. And if you want to keep uncovering the world's hidden truths with us, don't forget to subscribe to MindGap and hit the bell icon so you never miss a new mystery.